They said it couldn't be done. Landing a 28,000-pound helicopter on a rooftop the size of a bedroom? Impossible. But on November 10th, 2003, a 58-year-old Pennsylvania National Guard pilot did exactly that. And somehow, 34 soldiers walked off that mountain alive. This is the story of how one pilot's ridiculous idea became a technique now taught at every Army flight school in America. But here's what nobody expected. The man who pulled it off wasn't a hotshot combat pilot. He was a civilian medevac flyer who'd spent 28 years landing helicopters in hospital parking lots. So how did a small-town EMS pilot end up performing one of the most dangerous helicopter extractions in the Afghanistan war? Larry Murphy was not born to be a soldier. He was born in 1945 in Emmaus, Pennsylvania, a borough of 11,000 tucked into Lehigh County where farmland meets Appalachian foothills. His father worked maintenance at Lehigh Portland Cement Company, coming home each evening coated in gray dust. His mother raised 3 children in a narrow row house on Ridge Street. Larry graduated Emmaus High School in 1963 with no distinction. He took a job as a machinist at Mack Trucks, operating lathes that shaped engine blocks. The work paid $2.85 an hour. Then the draft notice arrived in 1965. The Army sent him to Fort Rucker for helicopter training. Not because he'd requested it, because the Army needed pilots for Vietnam and Larry's machinist background suggested mechanical aptitude. The reasoning was simple. If you could maintain tight tolerances on a lathe, maybe you could fly a Huey under fire. But here's the thing. Larry proved completely unremarkable in flight school. His instructors noted adequate performance, satisfactory hover work, acceptable navigation. He graduated middle of his class, received his wings, and deployed to Vietnam in 1966, flying medevac missions. For 13 months, he extracted wounded soldiers from landing zones carved into triple canopy jungle. He never spoke much about Vietnam after he returned. When pressed, he'd say only, "I brought them out. That was the job." After discharge in 1969, Larry returned to Emmaus. He married Sharon, a nurse. They bought a small house on Main Street, but he didn't return to Mack Trucks. Instead, he became a helicopter pilot with Keystone Helicopters, a civilian EMS company based at Lehigh Valley International Airport. So what did a medical evacuation pilot do that made him different from other pilots? He practiced something they called crazy. For 28 years, Larry flew medical evacuations across eastern Pennsylvania. He landed on highway medians, hospital parking lots, high school football fields at midnight. But during slow shifts, he'd practice something unusual. Pinnacle landings. What's a pinnacle landing? It's when you balance a helicopter on just its rear wheels, front end hanging in space, usually on mountain peaks or rock outcrops. Larry would practice at the hospital helipad. He'd balance the helicopter on its rear skids at the edge of the roof, front rotors hanging over empty space, holding position while rotor wash scattered equipment everywhere. The younger pilots thought he was showing off. The flight managers thought it was reckless. Larry never explained himself, but he never stopped practicing either. One paramedic, watching him hold a perfect 2-wheel hover for 90 seconds during a 1997 training exercise, asked why he bothered. "You'll never need that in Pennsylvania. This isn't Afghanistan." Larry shut down the turbines, filled out his logbook, and said quietly, "Maybe not, but if I do need it, I won't have time to practice." That was 1997. Larry was 52 years old. So here's the ironic part. 6 years later, the Pennsylvania Army National Guard activated Larry's old unit for deployment to Afghanistan. Larry was now 58, technically too old for combat deployments under standard Army regulations. He volunteered anyway. The Guard needed experienced pilots. They waived the age requirement. At Fort Indiantown Gap during pre-deployment training, younger pilots, men in their 20s and 30s, watched Larry during flight operations. He moved slowly, methodically. He checked every instrument twice. He flew smoothly but without flair. One 32-year-old captain with 800 flight hours commented to another pilot, "Murphy's solid, but he flies like he's transporting eggs, too cautious for combat." Another said, "He's a medevac guy. Probably never landed anywhere harder than a hospital roof." They didn't know about the Pinnacle training. Larry never mentioned it. By November 2003, the war in Afghanistan had entered its 3rd year. The initial invasion had toppled the Taliban government, but insurgent fighters had regrouped in Pakistan and were flowing back across the border. In Nuristan and Kunar provinces, mountainous regions along the Pakistani frontier, small Taliban cells conducted ambushes, planted IEDs, and attacked isolated American outposts. The terrain favored the insurgents. Mountains provided cover and escape routes. American forces operated from small FOBs connected by helicopter because the roads were death traps. Conventional tactics called for inserting troops onto wide, flat landing zones. But in the Hindu Kush, wide, flat spaces didn't exist. Pilots learned to land on slopes, on ridges, in ravines so narrow that rotor tips cleared rock walls by inches. Even so, there were limits. Army doctrine specified minimum LZ dimensions, 100 feet by 100 feet for a CH-47 Chinook. Anything smaller was considered too dangerous. The manual was clear. If the LZ doesn't meet minimums, you don't land. But what happens when there is no LZ at all? November 10th, 2003, 03:30 hours. Operation Mountain Resolve. A platoon from the 10th Mountain Division had inserted via helicopter into a village in Nuristan province 8 hours earlier. The mission: capture a Taliban commander coordinating attacks on coalition convoys. They got him. 3 insurgents captured without firing a shot. But here's what went wrong. The extraction plan called for pickup at dawn from a flat area 200 meters below the village. At 06:20 hours, a small earthquake, common in the region, triggered a rock slide that buried the landing zone under 40 feet of debris. The nearest alternate LZ was 6 kilometers away. 3 hours through exposed ridgelines. Taliban scouts had spotted the American helicopters during insertion. Word was spreading. If the platoon walked out, they'd be moving 35 people, including 3 restrained detainees, through terrain where every ridge offered an ambush point. There was one possibility: the rooftop of the compound where they'd captured the insurgents. Satellite imagery showed a flat roof, approximately 15 feet by 20 feet. The structure sat on the highest point of the ridge, with 60-foot drops on 3 sides. The 4th side faced a granite cliff wall 40 feet away. It wasn't a landing zone. It was a balcony. At 08:15 hours, 2 CH-47 Chinooks lifted off from FOB Asadabad. The lead helicopter, CH-1, piloted by Chief Warrant Officer 2 David Holt, arrived first. Holt circled the compound, descended, studied the rooftop. His voice came over the radio. Negative on this LZ. Rooftop is maybe 15 feet wide. Structure looks unstable. Can't risk a full landing. Recommend ground movement to alternate Bravo. Then Lieutenant Corrigan's voice crackled through. CH-1, be advised. We have movement in the valley below. At least 20 military-age males moving toward our position. We are compromised. Request immediate extraction. The TOC at Asadabad broke in. Chosin, alternate Bravo is 3 hours movement through exposed terrain. If you're compromised, you won't make it. 3 seconds of silence. Then Corrigan, understood. We'll fortify and wait for nightfall. Larry Murphy was flying CH-2. He descended through thin mountain air to 200 feet above the compound. Through the chin bubble, he studied the rooftop. Ancient mud brick walls. Timber beams visible through gaps in clay. 32 soldiers in defensive perimeter. 3 detainees bound against the wall. Murphy keyed the radio. CH-1. This is CH-2. I can get them out. Holt's voice came back. Say again, CH-2? I can land on 2 wheels. Rear wheels only. Keep the nose up, rotors clear of the cliff. They load from the ramp. 30 seconds on the ground. A pause. Then Holt. Murphy, that building won't support our weight. It will if I don't give it our full weight. Pinnacle landing. Tail rotor and rear wheels on the roof. Forward fuselage stays airborne. I'll hold it at 100% torque. The TOC broke in. CH-2. Confirm you are proposing to land a 28,000-pound aircraft on an unrated mud structure, using only rear landing gear? Affirmative. Another pause. Finally, CH-2. You are cleared to attempt at pilot's discretion. We have no other options. Murphy glanced at his co-pilot. Warrant Officer 1, Marcus Webb, 26 years old. Webb was staring at him. Sir, if that roof collapses, it won't. How do you know? Murphy adjusted the collective. The helicopter settled into hover 100 feet above the compound, because I've been practicing this for 6 years. But here's what made this truly insane. The altitude was 9,200 feet. The air was 30% thinner than at sea level. The helicopter was already struggling to maintain hover. The turbines were burning fuel at 900 pounds per hour, adding the precision of a two-wheel landing at 100% power on a structure that might disintegrate under them. That wasn't just difficult. It was borderline suicidal. Murphy began his approach, 30 feet per minute, half his normal rate. Why so slow? To conserve rotor energy in thin air. At 50 feet, he reduced forward airspeed to 5 knots. The granite cliff face loomed ahead. The front rotor, 60 feet in diameter, would pass within 15 feet of solid rock. At 30 feet, Murphy tilted the nose up 12 degrees. The tail dropped. Rear wheels extended below the fuselage. At 20 feet, the rear wheels aligned with the rooftop. He could see the surface now. Packed clay, cracked, weathered. Visible seams between timber beams underneath. The wheels needed to contact those load-bearing beams, not the clay between them. Target area, 2 feet wide, 6 feet long. Miss by 1 foot in any direction? The wheels punch through the roof or slide off the edge into empty space. At 10 feet, rotor wash hit the rooftop. Dust exploded into a blinding cloud. Murphy lost visual reference. So how do you land when you can't see? He shifted to instruments. Radar altimeter. Attitude indicator. His hands made micro-adjustments by feel as much as sight. 5 feet. The dust thickened. The helicopter shuddered in its own rotor wash. 2 feet. The rear wheels touched mud brick. Murphy felt it through the airframe. A slight jolt. Resistance as weight transferred. He held the collective steady. Nose elevated. Front wheels suspended 8 feet above the rooftop. The turbines screamed at 102% torque, exceeding normal operating limits. 24,000 pounds of aircraft balanced on 2 wheels and thrust. Rotors spinning 225 times per minute, generating 14,000 shaft horsepower through pure mechanical force. Murphy's hands trembled with the strain. 1 degree too much pitch? The nose drops, bringing forward wheels down with crushing force. 1 degree too little? The tail settles backward, pulling the aircraft off the roof's edge into a 60-foot fall. Murphy keyed the intercom. Ramp down, load passengers, 30 seconds. Behind him, the loadmaster lowered the rear ramp. Its lips settled onto the rooftop with a metallic clang. Soldiers were already moving. First came the detainees. 3 men, hooded and flex-cuffed. Each step transferred weight to the rear of the aircraft, shifting the center of gravity. Murphy compensated instantly, reducing collective pressure by millimeters, letting the rear wheels settle more firmly while keeping the front end elevated. Next came the wounded, 2 soldiers on improvised stretchers, then the interpreter, then the rifleman. 15 seconds, 20, the building beneath them groaned. Murphy felt it through the airframe. Low vibration, almost inaudible under rotor noise, but distinct. The timber beams were flexing. How much weight can century-old wood support? The rear landing gear contacted the roof across 8 square feet. With 16,000 pounds resting on those beams, the loading was roughly 2,000 pounds per square foot. The groaning intensified. 25 seconds. Murphy's hands tightened on the controls. If the roof began to collapse, he had perhaps 2 seconds to react. Increase collective. Lift off before the structure disintegrated completely. Hope the sudden weight shift didn't cause the helicopter to roll inverted as the tail dropped into the collapsing building. 28 seconds. Murphy felt the aircraft settle another inch. The rear wheels sank into clay. Dust puffed from cracks spreading outward, through the windscreen. He saw a chunk of clay break from the roof's edge, tumbling down the mountainside in slow motion. The edge was crumbling. The entire structure was on the verge of catastrophic failure. Murphy's thumb hovered over the collective's force trim release, ready to pull maximum power. The loadmaster. Ramp clear. All personnel aboard. Murphy didn't wait. He pulled collective, pushed forward on the cyclic. tilted the nose down. The turbine screamed 104% torque beyond emergency limits as the rotors bit into thin air. The rear wheels lifted, breaking contact with the roof. The helicopter rose, painfully, slowly, fighting for purchase in air too thin to provide proper lift. 5 feet up. 10. The front rotor cleared the cliff face by 12 feet, closer than intended, but acceptable. Below, the rooftop trembled. Then, with a sound like distant thunder, the center beam snapped. The roof collapsed inward. Dust billowed upward in a gray cloud. Murphy leveled at 500 feet, turned southwest toward FOB Asadabad, and reduced power to normal cruise settings. His hands were slick with sweat. His shoulders ached from holding position. His ears rang from the turbine scream. Webb, in the right seat, exhaled audibly. Jesus Christ. Murphy said nothing. He updated the navigation computer, checked fuel state, enough for 45 minutes plus 20 minutes reserve, and maintained heading. Behind them, Taliban fighters reached the compound 20 minutes later. They found the collapsed roof, American boot prints in the dust. Nothing else. If Murphy had waited 5 more seconds to lift off, the roof would have collapsed, with the helicopter still on it. 34 people would have gone down with the building. There would have been no survivors from a 60-foot fall in a disintegrating aircraft. But Murphy didn't wait, and 34 people flew home. 60 minutes later, the Chinook touched down at FOB Asadabad. Detainees transferred to military intelligence. Wounded soldiers to the field hospital. Lieutenant Corrigan and his platoon unloaded, gear filthy with dust, expressions hollow with exhaustion. Corrigan found Murphy near the flight line, conducting post-flight inspection. The pilot was on his knees, examining the rear landing gear for stress fractures, running his hands along hydraulic lines and struts. "Sir," Corrigan said. Murphy looked up. "I don't know how you did that, but you saved 34 lives today." Murphy stood, wiping grease from his hands. "Just following procedure. Pinnacle landings are in the manual." "Not on someone's roof." "They're not." Murphy didn't respond. He returned to his inspection. At 1600 hours, the commanding officer called Murphy into his office. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Sims studied him. "Chief, I watched the gun camera footage from Chalk 1. What you did was either the finest piece of flying I've seen in 20 years, or the most reckless." "Yes, sir." "Which was it?" Murphy considered. "It was necessary, sir." Sims leaned back. The mission was successful. All personnel extracted safely. The detainee provided actionable intelligence. 3 cache sites and 2 safe houses identified. That said, you exceeded torque limits. You operated outside standard LZ parameters. You subjected the aircraft to loads beyond design tolerances. Maintenance needs to replace 2 rotor head bearings and retorque 14 bolts before that bird flies again. Murphy nodded. "Understood, sir. I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. The paperwork's already submitted." Murphy's expression didn't change. "That's not necessary, sir. It's already done, Chief." Dismissed. The Distinguished Flying Cross was approved 3 months later. Murphy received it during a brief ceremony at Bagram Airfield, attended by his unit and the soldiers from chosen platoon. When asked to speak, he said, "I was just doing my job. Any pilot in the 28th would have done the same." Later, alone, Sergeant Mendez, the loadmaster who'd watched the roof collapse seconds after liftoff, asked Murphy how he'd known the structure would hold long enough. Murphy was silent for a moment. Then, "I didn't." By March 2004, word of the Kantiwa extraction had spread through the aviation community in Afghanistan. Pilots discussed it in ready rooms, analyzing approach angles and power settings. Some called it brilliant. Others called it insane. Most agreed they wouldn't have attempted it. But at Fort Rucker, Alabama, the Army's primary helicopter training facility, instructors quietly began incorporating the Kantiwa scenario into advanced flight training. So here's what most people don't know about modern Army helicopter training. There's a technique now taught at Fort Rucker called the Murphy landing. The case study presented during high-altitude operations courses. A pilot faced with an undersized LZ, thin air, and no alternatives. The solution: precise 2-wheel pinnacle landing, maximum power hover, minimum ground time. Instructors never explained the origin to students. but pilots who deployed to Afghanistan after 2004 learned the technique that saved 34 lives. By 2006, a version of the maneuver was formally included in the CH-47 Advanced Tactics Manual under non-standard landing zones. The procedure specified, in extremist situations where conventional landing is impossible, pilots may attempt rear-wheel-only landings on elevated structures, provided structural integrity can be reasonably assessed, and hover power margins allow sustained hover at required altitude. It was official recognition that sometimes breaking the rules saves lives. Murphy deployed twice more, 2005 and 2008. Both tours were uneventful by comparison. He flew cargo missions, troop insertions, medevac flights. He performed no more rooftop landings. He didn't need to. In 2009, at age 64, Murphy retired from the Pennsylvania National Guard after 44 years of service. He returned to Emmaus, to Sharon and their grandchildren. He took a part-time job as a flight instructor at Lehigh Valley International Airport, teaching young pilots how to hover, how to land in tight spaces, how to stay calm when the gauges say you're out of options. When students asked about his most difficult landing, he'd say, Afghanistan, rooftop extraction, tight space. When they pressed for details, he'd shrug. Just followed procedure. Nothing special. In 2017, Larry Murphy died at age 72 from complications of lung disease, a common affliction among veterans exposed to burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan. His obituary in the Morning Call newspaper ran 8 lines, noting his service with the Pennsylvania National Guard and his career with Keystone helicopters. It made no mention of Kantiwa, of the rooftop, of 34 lives saved. His funeral was held at Cedar Hill Memorial Park in Allentown. 16 soldiers from the 28th CAB attended, along with 7 members of chosen platoon who'd flown from across the country. Lieutenant Colonel Sims, retired, delivered the eulogy. He mentioned the Distinguished Flying Cross. He mentioned dedication, professionalism, and quiet courage. He did not mention that Larry Murphy had performed an extraction every flight instructor said was impossible, because Larry Murphy wouldn't have wanted the attention. Today, Murphy's DFC hangs in the Pennsylvania Military Museum in Boalsburg, Pennsylvania, in a display case alongside medals from other Guard aviators. Most visitors walk past without stopping. The placard reads, Chief Warrant Officer 3, Larry J. Murphy, 28th Combat Aviation Brigade, Distinguished Flying Cross, 2004, for heroism, while participating in aerial flight during Operation Enduring Freedom. It says nothing about a rooftop, nothing about a 15-foot landing zone, nothing about how one pilot, using a technique everyone thought was reckless, saved an entire platoon because he'd spent 6 years practicing something he hoped he'd never need. But at Fort Rucker, in the Advanced Tactics classroom, flight instructors still teach the Murphy landing. There's a temptation to think stories like this are myths. It's easy to believe that heroism requires dramatic declarations, that saving lives means charging into fire with weapons blazing, that extraordinary acts must look extraordinary in the moment. But the truth is different. Wars are decided not by grand strategy alone, but by machinists who become pilots, by EMS flyers who practice maneuvers their colleagues mock, by 58-year-old men who volunteer for combat deployments because they know how to land helicopters where others can't. Larry Murphy didn't win the war in Afghanistan, but on November 10th, 2003, he brought 34 people home alive from a ridge in Nuristan province where they would have died. He did it by balancing 24,000 pounds of aircraft on 2 wheels and thrust, by holding position while a century-old building groaned beneath him, by lifting off seconds before the structure collapsed. And he did it because, years earlier, on a hospital rooftop in Pennsylvania, he decided that someday, somewhere, someone might need a pilot willing to do the ridiculous thing. Sometimes that's what heroism looks like. Not glory, not recognition, just a man doing a job he'd spent a lifetime preparing for in the only moment that mattered. Sometimes, the most ridiculous landing is the one that saves everyone. What would you have done in Murphy's position? Would you have attempted a landing every regulation said was impossible, knowing one mistake meant 34 people die? What shocked you most the 2-foot margin of error, the roof collapsing seconds after liftoff, or that this ridiculous technique is now standard Army training. Did you know that the CH-47 Chinook can balance on just its rear wheels? Most people don't, but now every combat pilot does, because of what happened on that rooftop. Let us know in the comments below. If you believe the quietest heroes deserve the loudest recognition, share this with someone who thinks helicopter pilots just fly in straight lines. Because sometimes the most important rescues are the ones nobody photographs, performed by pilots nobody celebrates, in helicopters that barely make it home. Because sometimes ridiculous is just another word for necessary.